So over the past few weeks, we've been exploring stories from the life of the Buddha, particularly following the lead of from Vishvapani's book, Gautama Buddha, which really emphasizes what, as much as we know historically about the Buddha, and sourcing from original texts and the Pali Canon particularly, the sutras, the writings of early Buddhism, the earliest writings really. So really a very clear and very readable, very enjoyable exploration of what we really know about the Buddha, the historical Buddha. And we've heard about the Buddha from pre-enlightenment through stories of his enlightenment, and tonight we come to the Buddha's final days. And I just really want to tell the story of the Buddha's final days. For me, there's nothing more satisfying than telling stories of the Buddha. It's so inspiring and such a privilege to be able to do that. In a sense, it doesn't need anything else for me. The Buddha's life and example is truly beautiful in places, remarkable and inspiring in others, but it never fails to engage. And particularly this story. It's the longest story of any sutta, so we won't be able to cover all of it. But as with most of the Buddha's explorations, most of the stories of the Buddha are about his meetings with people, and particularly when he meets and he's responding to people in the moment, meeting the objective needs of the situation, really meeting what's needed in that particular situation. And it's very individual to the individuals that he meets. And so this final journey starts at Vulture's Peak. So Vulture's Peak is a place near Rajgir in India, and it's a very striking place. It's two great rocky outcrops, mountainous outcrops. And when you get to the top of them, the plains just fall away quite remarkably. You get quite a dizzying scene really when you're up there. If you ever go, don't go to the World Peace Pagoda on the other side. That's not Vulture's Peak. Go to the one without anything on it. Just saying. I made the mistake of going to the World Peace Pagoda and have to go to the other place. So, but is a tremendous place, and the Buddha was at the tip of Vulture's Peak, and often he'd be teaching there. And in this particular story, King Ajatasattu had decided he wanted to attack the Vijayans. So it's a really strange start to a story about the great decease of the Buddha, that it's about a local king wanting to attack a neighbouring kingdom. But I suppose the end of every life happens very much in a worldly way. There's nothing remarkable about it in a certain sense. Life is just happening. And so the Buddha is 80 years old at this time, and when King Ajatasattu sends one of his ambassadors to the Buddha, and he makes asks the Buddha a question, and he identifies the intention of Ajatasattu to attack the Vijayans. And so the Buddha is friendly with the Vijayans. They've been generous to him, but so has King Ajatasattu, and he doesn't want to offend him. So he speaks. He doesn't answer the question directly when put to him, will King Ajatasattu be successful? He talks to Ananda, about who is his attendant of 25 years, and asks a number of questions. And he says, well, do they meet regularly in large numbers? Do they meet in harmony, in part in harmony? And if then, Ananda confirms that they do. And this will serve their prospering and not their decline. And do they not do what is not authorized, respecting their elders, listening to them, caring for them? And Ananda says, yes, they do. And in this way, they can be expected to prosper and not decline. And do they acknowledge their rituals and rules of training and their historical shrines and preserve what is to be preserved? And Ananda says, yes, they do. And the Buddha mentions, well, this is the reason they will prosper and not decline. So the ambassador that comes to the Buddha interprets this, unfortunately. He interprets this that the way to defeat the Vijayans is to sow discord and disharmony. So he really misunderstands. But that is what King Ajatasattu eventually goes and does. But this conversation put the Buddha in mind of he's advancing in his years, and he really turns his mind to the community of monks. And I think this is the start of, what does he need to put in place in order that the community will prosper and not decline after he's gone? And he repeats something similar for the monks. He entreats them to hold regular and frequent assemblies, to meet and break up in harmony, to continue with faith, modesty, to fear wrongdoing, to arouse vigour, yes, and to be established in mindfulness and wisdom. These are particularly 7 factors of enlightenment that are regularly repeated within the Pali Canon. He encourages them to reflect on impermanence, insubstantiality, and the unsatisfactoriness of life, and also the reflections on conditionality. So when you read this sutta, you really get a sense that you're getting all of the teachings in a certain way. If you reflected on this sutta, everything's in there. Everything can be pulled out. And then there's this beautiful passage about when showing loving kindness in public and in private, and sharing everything, even the contents of one's own bowl. So even the contents of the alms bowl, which were your only sustenance, you would share with your brothers in the spiritual life. So there's a strong emphasis on generosity. And I remember Subhadramati saying once in this class, just imagine if your life were dominated by the principle of generosity. Just sort of imagine that and take it in. What would that be like? In a certain way, that's what the Buddha is evoking in this particular passage. So he was concerned for the Sangha to prosper and not decline. And then we're not clear on why he then set to wandering, but perhaps he had a sense that that he was getting up in years. He was 80 years old. The body was aging, decaying, declining, and he needed to communicate with as many people as possible, as much of the community as possible. So he set out to travel with Ananda, and in the text it says a large retinue of monks, although Vishwapani says it's likely to be a smaller group. So, and everywhere he goes, he emphasizes ethics, meditation, and wisdom again and again, particularly the cultivation of ethics, the practice of meditation, and reflection on the lakshanas, impermanence, insubstantiality, and unsatisfactoriness. And he comes to a small town called Nandika, where he is besieged by many questions about people recently deceased and what was their destination after death. And he initially answered the inquiries, and so he was saying, this person is a stream winner, so they are firmly on the path of enlightenment. This one will only return once, and so he goes on. And but he says to Ananda, it is not remarkable. It's just not remarkable that those who have come to a human birth should die, but that you should come to the Tathagata to ask the fate of each one of those who have died. This is a weariness to him. So, that sort of struck me a little bit. So, why would the Buddha be weary? What's the meaning of that? What do you think? Any sense of that? What is it that would make a Buddha weary?
Well, in relation to these questions.
Yeah.
It's perhaps a bit tiresome. It's sort of a bit fortune telling, a bit really. Why sort of ask what's going to happen? It's a bit immediate.
Yeah. So there's a sort of, a speculation, perhaps. I mean, the Buddha would know. That's one of the powers of the Buddha, to see former lives and to see the fate of others. Yeah? But there's something to this that's, I think, quite important for us to bear in mind. What is the Buddha getting at when he's saying this is a weariness to him? So he wants to avoid speculation. He wants to certainly avoid us getting into speculation. He was metaphysically reticent a lot of the time.
Is it that it doesn't matter?
It really doesn't matter, does it? Yeah. Can you say more about that?
Well, as far as our experience right now, it doesn't really matter what happens to us in death, because I'm not dead yet.
But what are the causes and conditions for our next life?
Is it in terms of the weariness, is it something to do with the clinging that is presupposed in the question, that if you're asking about what the fate of a previous being is, there's a sense of comparison there, and the premise is, well, what can I do to avoid, what do they do to not avoid it? But the premise is, there's a clinging to life, a clinging to, youth, life, and
there could be an element of that. That he's encouraging people to cling less, yes, to not be so attached. Yeah. The Buddha was frequently quite pragmatic about that. It was quite unsentimental in a way, to not encourage people towards attachment to those things that they could not change, that they just couldn't change. There's nothing they can do about it. But we worry so much about that which we cannot influence or change. Yeah? We can't do anything about it. And I wonder whether sometimes for the Buddha it was a sort of frustration how much we set up our own suffering in that way by worrying about things that we can't change. So we worry about the loss of this item or that person, and yes, we don't care any less about them, but do we add undue suffering through that intense attachment? The Buddha would encourage a lessening of that attachment to things against we can do little, yes, about what we can do little. And not only that, but it's a distraction. So the Buddha goes on to say that he goes on to give a teaching of the mirror of the Dharma. You can hold up the mirror of the Dharma to your current life. Your current life is the best way of knowing what your destination will be on death. You're creating your future now through your actions of body, speech and mind. Yeah. So know what's coming through today's actions. Yeah. So it's just worth bearing in mind. So I thought it was quite strong of the Buddha to say, well, it's wearisome. Yeah. Just don't trouble yourselves with these questions. Because the Buddha is a very, his mind is bright and has unobstructed energy. So it's strange that he should say it's wearisome. So it's worth just dwelling on that a little bit. So I think what he's pointing to is that what your future you're creating now, your experience in the future you're creating now through today's actions. Yeah, you're perfuming the consequences of your life today. Yeah. So I just wanted to dwell on that really, because I think it was, it just really struck me as quite strong. But not uncaring, yeah. Not wishing to dismiss, but really to make clear what's profitable, what's useful. Yeah. So they go forward. And they come to a mango grove near Vaishali, which is owned by the courtesan Ambapali, who, hearing that the Buddha is in the vicinity, makes haste to the Buddha and invites him and his monks to a meal at her palace. Well, she's a courtesan, so it's a pleasure palace. Yeah. So the Buddha consents with the retinue of monks, and she makes haste back. And on the road back, she comes across a number of Lichavi youths who were like the dandies of the day, and the sort of minor nobles. And she informs them that the Buddha has accepted her invitation. And they exclaim, "We've been cheated by the mango girl." Really just, there was a sort of sense of competition for the Buddha, a real sense of how important it was to entertain the Buddha and his monks. But I think, again, there's nothing without significance that the Buddha does or is written down here. And often the Buddha, you find, will respond to people who are receptive. Yeah? Who respond to people who are receptive. Now, Ambapali was a courtesan, yeah? And not a sort of common prostitute, as it were, but a courtesan. But often we would, and today we make all kinds of judgments about who people are, what they do, what the type of life they spent, and we tend to fix them as sort of that type of person, that type of individual that we will or will not associate with, and no such thing applied to the Buddha. Murderers and courtesans and all kinds of individuals were welcome into the Sangha. But what was, I think, notable was Amberpali's devotion and receptivity, which I think the Buddha responded to, because soon after having spent time with him, she joined the Sangha of nuns, and she there's a lovely passage in the book by Vishvapani where it has her reflecting later in life on herself, and you get a sense of how she was and how she is now. She says, "My hair was black as a bee with curly ends. Now it's rough as old hemp. Adorned with flowers, it smelled like perfumed box. Now it reeks like a mangy dog. I had a sweet voice like a cuckoo in the jungle thicket. Now it's cracked with age. My breasts were swollen, round, compact and high. Now they sag like empty water bags. Such was my body. Now it is a place of pain. Dilapidated like an old house with the plaster falling off." So this was Ambrapali reflecting back after. It doesn't sound very attractive for the spiritual life, I must say, but there's humour in there, isn't there? There's humour. There's a sort of warm looking back. But that old age was very much with the Buddha now. And while staying there in the rainy season, became very unwell, in such pain that he thought he might die. And he felt close to death, but reflected, it is not right for me to pass away without addressing those who have attended on me, taking leave of those monks. I must use my strength to suppress this illness and maintain the life force. And the disease abated, but Ananda noticed and was worried, concerned, and expressed this to the Buddha. So, so the Buddha continued wandering, continued teaching, and the only real time he got relief from pain and suffering was when he withdrew from the senses in deep meditation. And I think that there's quite a lot to say for meditation awareness and how we respond to pain and suffering in the world. And this sense of turning towards it and making, in a way, not adding to it, not ignoring it, but not adding to it in terms of heaping on suffering, which the Buddha was clearly not doing. He was continuing to walk, continuing to teach whenever he met people. But Ananda saw the Buddha was weakened and was concerned. And the Buddha responded saying, "Ananda, I'm an old man. I'm an old man who has done his time and reached old age. I've turned 80, and just as a worn-out cart is kept going with the help of repairs, so it seems my body only is kept going with the help of repairs. So Ananda, you should live with yourself as your island of refuge and not someone else. With the truth as your refuge and not something else." Yeah. So he was very gently encouraging Ananda to let go, to foster non-attachment, to really see that he goes on to say, be a light unto yourself. Yeah? To be resourceful, to develop inner resources, to develop a sense of containment and resolve, and to practice. And not to be dependent on the person of the Buddha, but the principle of the Dharma. To not be dependent on the person of the Buddha, but the principle of the Dharma that he communicated. And so they go on, and they're at a shrine at Kapala. The Buddha intimated that a person of developed shining consciousness could determine the length of their life, but the duration of this life was not implied, was not made clear. So he seemed to suggest or hint or intimate that if somebody were to request the Buddha to stay, that he could decide to stay. But Ananda didn't take the hint, we're told. Okay, he didn't take the hint. It was missed. And whilst the Buddha was meditating, his old adversary, Mara, arrived, and who reminded the Buddha of his resolve to establish the community of monks and to practice and communicate the Dharma before he passed away. And the Buddha said that he'd done this. And Mara said, well, I think it's about time for the parinirvana then. Reminding the Buddha that it's time to die. And the Buddha was unmoved by this and said, fear not, Mara. In 3 months I will now enter the parinirvana. And he relinquished the life principle. And at that moment the earth quaked and there was thunder and lightning. So the Buddha relinquished the life principle. So and he reflected, balancing the incomparable against existence, the sage gave up the force of becoming. Concentrated deep within, he rent his existence like a coat of mail. So, now this is interesting because the Buddha is enlightened, which means he's seen through self-clinging. But it seems to imply that doesn't mean that you let go of life. In fact, you come into life most fully. Yes, you open up to life. You have life experience unobstructed. Yes, at the point of enlightenment. But there's clearly a time when all compounded things, as the Buddha would say, are of the nature to decay, and that is what he's referring to is the human body. Yes, this coat of mail. He rent this coat of mail. He let go of the life principle in relation to the human body, but not the enlightenment principle. Yeah? So it is of nature of the body to decay, and there's only so long a body can last. It could probably be. He could probably have willed it to go longer. Yeah? Could probably have willed it to go longer, but didn't. And I think there's a teaching in that too. But that's to be reflected on. And he explained the meaning of the earthquake to Ananda. And at this point, Ananda begged him to stay. But it was too late. And the Buddha explains that Ananda could have asked him, but didn't. Now we don't know exactly why this is in the text, but Ananda's got quite a lot of stick over the years for not asking the Buddha to stay. He's been a sort of fall guy for that, but but I don't. You don't know exactly how long the Buddha could have gone on for anyway in that dilapidated body, or that decaying body, or even whether it would have been desirable, or kind even. So we'll move on from that. But he just gazed back at Vaishali and said, "This is the last time I will see Vaishali." So they continued on. And he continued spending time with the monks and teaching. And he travelled to Parva village, where again he stayed in a local mango grove of the metalsmith named Kunda. And he was afforded a sumptuous meal of pig's delight. Or also known as tender boar. Now, we don't know what this is. We're assuming it involved pig. But it's caused a controversy over time about, well, was the Buddha a vegetarian? If the Buddha wasn't a vegetarian, should we be? And now, I was thinking about this over the weekend, and I was wondering, well, actually, but the way the Buddha lived, with one robe and one bowl, and you have to accept anything that's put in your bowl. In a certain way, well, he's definitely gone beyond likes and dislikes, attachment and aversion. He's not creating any new karma. At the point of enlightenment, you don't create any new karma. But it's very important to him to allow others to be generous, to allow others to afford the meal. And it was always a principle that he didn't decline. So he didn't exercise likes and dislikes. Now for us, we're still creating karma by our actions of body, speech and mind. And so for us, the first principle of the precept of no harm needs to be thought through very fully. And so I don't think we can possibly rationalise on the basis that the Buddha ate anything that was put in his bowl to avoid vegetarianism as a possibility. So I'm just challenging a little bit, but it is a controversy that's been made around this point. But I digress, and I wanted to carry on with the story. So he said, feed, by all means serve me this, but don't serve any to the community of monks. Whatever's left over should be buried in a pit. And subsequently the Buddha became very ill, passing blood in his stool. And but he was clear that Kunda should not be punished or harmed for offering the Buddha his last meal, or for there should be any suggestion that he's caused the Buddha harm. To serve the Buddha his last meal is an auspicious thing, and that's how it should be seen. So yes, what I get from this, is just this continuous generosity of spirit, this continuous concern, despite profound illness, serious illness. His concern is for others. I think this is really quite remarkable. It's easily overlooked, actually, that when I'm ill, I want to sort of get on my couch with a duvet, be served soup, and not really do very much, and sort of withdraw and think, oh, woe is me. And but that's not happening here. Despite being, deeply unwell, his concern is for others, which just I think a little remarkable. And it's just worth reflecting on what our response to illness is versus the Buddha's. And perhaps, can we take any lead from that? Can we take any example from that? It's worth thinking about. And so he recovered slightly, and they went on. And came across a disciple of his former meditation teacher, Arada Kalama, by the name of Pakusa, who the Buddha gave a teaching to, and as is often the case when the Buddha gives teachings, he said, "It's amazing, Lord, it's wonderful. It's as if something that was overturned is turned upright, as if a light has been shone in the darkness." And was so grateful he afforded the Buddha a golden robe, and which was placed on the Buddha. And Ananda happened to comment that when the robe was put on the Buddha, it seemed to dim. It seemed to become dull, but the Buddha himself was more radiant, more bright, more golden. And so the Buddha said, well, there are two occasions when this happens. On the night of the enlightenment and on the eve of the parinirvana. And in the last watch of the night tonight, the parinirvana of the Buddha will occur. And so they journeyed on to Kusanagara, the place historically now where there is a stupa to the Buddha and a parinirvana Buddha, the place where the Buddha's parinirvana occurred. And they were walking along the road, and the people, the malas of the time, had planted rows of sal trees, and the Buddha was tired, and he asked Ananda to create a bed between two sal trees with his head to the north. And he lay on this bed, and the sal trees burst into unseasonable blossom and rained blossoms down on the Buddha. And it was dawning on Ananda that this was nearing the end, and he was overcome with grief, but he didn't want the Buddha to see his grief, so he took himself away from the community of monks, and there's an image of him propped up in a doorway weeping, but the Buddha of course noticed he'd gone away and requested that he'd return. And this is one of the most moving scenes, I think, from the parinirvana, because it's Ananda's reflection on the Buddha. They'd been together 25 years. They'd shared the deepest of friendships, the most sincere affection and love, challenged and supported each other. Ananda was never afraid to ask a question of the Buddha. He had a particularly remarkable memory and had an arrangement with the Buddha that any time the Buddha gave a teaching, if Ananda wasn't present, that he'd repeat it. Yeah? And so Ananda never missed the teachings. He had a particularly retentive memory, and he's credited with the fact that we have all the sutras today, because he could remember them and recite them to the community of monks after the Buddha's death, after the death of the Buddha's body. And he was saying, the light is going out of the world, the Lord is dying, he who was so kind. And that's just, I think, one of the most moving things. It's just that deep friendship, that great love between two friends, that's held by Ananda in that moment. He who was so kind. Not he who was so wise, but he who was so kind. So the overwhelming experience of meeting the Buddha was one of kindness, not only of being met with what you need, but of being met with kindness. And it wasn't true for anybody other than Ananda, as his primary attendant for 25 years. But the Buddha called to Ananda and said, "Enough, Ananda. Do not grieve and lament. Have I not warned you about this before? We must lose and be deprived of and separated from everything that is pleasant and dear. How else could it be otherwise? For a long time, you have attended me helpfully, gladly, and wholeheartedly. You have done well. Ananda, keep applying yourself and you will be free." And he doesn't stop there. He then goes on and rejoices in Ananda's merits to the collected assembly, of his ability to receive people, of his ability to teach, and when people hear him teach, they're pleased, and when he doesn't teach, they're disappointed. And he just really rejoices in Ananda. And So and a little later, Ananda wonders why the Buddha has decided to pass away in what he describes this wattle and daub of a place in the back of beyond. But the Buddha knows it was once a great city. It was once a great city, and he was the ruler of that city in times past. But moving his mind from the mythic past to the followers of the present, he asked Ananda to collect the monks and let the community know that he was going to pass away in the last watch of the night, and many local townsfolk and other monks came to pay their respects to the Buddha, and you can imagine the scene of grief and devotion at the idea that the Buddha might be passing away. And the Buddha's relative, Ananda's relative, Anuruddha, arrived, but many of his family had passed away previously. And so we come to the final moments of the Buddha's life, and there is a traveller called Subhadda who had recently lost his brother, who was desperately trying to make sense of it and had heard the Buddha was in the vicinity and wanted to come and hear him teach. And so, but it was prevented from approaching the Buddha by Ananda because because the Buddha was on the eve of his parinirvana, because the Buddha was tired. But again, sensing that Subhadda was receptive, the Buddha asked for him to be let through and gave him a teaching. And so Subhadda became the Buddha's last disciple, having been so open and receptive to the Buddha's teaching. Went for refuge at that time. And so right up into his last minutes, it seems, the Buddha was teaching and helping others, continuously helping others. At this point he asked the community of monks whether they had any doubts. Now is the time. Now is the time to ask. If you have any doubts, anything at all. And if you can't say yourself, let your friend know, and let him say, or her say. And the community was silent. there were no doubts. The collected monks and community were confident, had faith in the Dharma, in the Buddha and the Sangha. Monks, now I take my leave of you. It is of the nature of things to decay. With mindfulness, strive on. And so the Buddha passed into meditation, into the 4 dhyanas, the 4 superconscious states. And he entered the first, and then emerging from that he attained the second, and so up through to the 4th, and then back down through the dhyanas, and then he passed away. And Anuruddha broke the silence. With unshrinking mind, he endured his pain. Like the quenching of a lamp was the deliverance of his mind. So, I'd like to finish by us chanting